That's fantastic. Let's go straight into it. I'm glad we're able to reschedule. And what I wanted to talk to you about was this article that Sarah Ladd did for the Louisville Courier Journal, October 2020. Kentucky Representative Atticus Scott sponsored Brianna's Law for Kentucky. I think it would be safe to say that she is what you might consider like our own AOC, the progressive and all that other kind of good stuff there.
Right.
She was quoted, she meaning Atticus Scott, blacks are facing two pandemics in the United States of America, the coronavirus and systemic racism. Then Scott drew a parallel between policing and slavery. I want to make it clear to my listeners, she's not talking about 21st century human trafficking. She's talking about slavery that was abolished in the United States of America in 1863. I'm going to quote here because she wrote something in response, I think primarily to these quotes right here. And I wanted to talk to you about your response. Black people are disproportionately impacted by Corona 19 and constantly under the terror of the system of policing, a system that grew out of keeping our black bodies enslaved. And she continues, white night watchmen would hunt us down as if we done to escape the bondages of human trafficking known as slavery. So she's saying white track us down like animals. Continue with the quote, they would hunt us down and drag us back by our hair to the hellhole of bondage and captivity. What did we do to deserve that? These watchmen are now in today's police forces. And speaking to my listeners, Doug Sweeney, he's had a great, fantastic career as a police officer. And he wrote a response to what Attica Scott said as she was quoted in this October 23rd, 2020 Louisville Courier Journal article. Doug, give us your response there.
Yeah. My first thought is, boy, what a giant leap. And I think I specifically said something about that's a nice job of engaging in some sophistry to make a specious argument. Today's police officers can trace their profession directly back to those white night watchmen of the past, implying that the evil of those men is in the DNA of today's professional officers. I said, that's like saying that today's barbers must be no different than the barbers of past centuries who did bloodletting, performed some gruesome surgeries. I guess, boy, I should be afraid every time I go to the barber now, right? Or how about let's get a little more recent? I was thinking we can just go back to the early 60s and before. How about the late 50s? The Democrats, especially mostly Southern Democrats, by the way, I believe the Kentucky senator is withheld from this document that you've probably heard, the Southern Manifesto. I think it was officially called the Declaration of Constitutional Principles. This is sometime in early 56 in Congress. They got all these signatures on to say, hey, we are opposed to racial integration of public areas. 19 senators, 82 representatives from the South signed it. They filibustered the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a record 60 days, I believe, primarily led by the majority, which was Democrats. To be fair, I think a bipartisan alliance between, was it Everett Dirksen and Hubert Humphrey were working behind the scenes feverishly to defeat that, and they did. It's pretty well known that Democrats were opposed in large numbers to the Civil Rights Act. So should I assume then that they're going back to the night watchmen to say that the policemen of today, that's what they have in their hearts? Should we say then that today's Democrats are no different than those Democrats of the late 50s and early 60s? Is that what we're dealing with? Should I be suspicious of any of today's Democrats because what their recent forebears were known for? It's the same kind of argument, in my opinion, Corbin, and it's fallacious. It's a terrible conflation of unequal realities.
What I found interesting about the article, as she was quoted in the Courier Journal, when our Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, had the press conference about the grand jury and Breonna Taylor and stating that we're not going to go after those police officers. I believe the Black Lives Matter representative here in Louisville connected Daniel Cameron to slavery, the slaves who were the overseers of the other slaves, and that they're in cahoots with the white man. It's an interesting mode of thinking. Do you have any sort of thoughts or feelings or reflections on that?
Corbin, what's the most lethal bullet you can fire at someone, figuratively speaking, if you disagree with their argument or you disagree with their actions? Well, clearly he's a racist. He's black, but he is only by coincidence of the color of skin, because he certainly is black in his heart. He is a racist. He must hate himself for all I know. But racism is a catch-all accusation to shut down anybody. And the facts of the matter are, if you look at them, and Daniel Cameron has, are that the reason there was nobody charged with murder or reckless homicide or manslaughter is because the elements of the Kentucky Revised Statute do not match it. I made an analogy with someone. I used to do a lot of narcotics work, Corbin. There were people that were high-level dealers. Sometimes I caught them, sometimes I didn't. But based on 3-4 different informants, your own investigative work, you just knew that somebody was the dealer. But you have to catch them legally. If I've been after a dealer that I know's been pushing weight, pounds and pounds of marijuana, let's say, and I finally catch him in a legal stop, and he's got a half ounce of marijuana in a bag. Well, there you go. I'm going to charge this guy with felony trafficking, 5 pounds or more, or whatever the statute now says. I think it's got to be above 8 ounces and less than 5 pounds is a felony to start with. Well, the other say, wait a minute, you can't do that. I said, well, why not? I know in my heart this guy is guilty. Everybody knows it. You ask anybody on the street. Yeah, but you got him with half ounce of weed. That's a misdemeanor. That's like a citation. Well, yeah, I know it does, but this guy's guilty. We've got to charge. We can't let this guy get away with what he did. We just believe this to be true. Well, it's not true in that case because the elements of the crime were not met. He did not have the sufficient weight to charge him. Just as in the case of the officers in question, the elements of the crime and what had to be in place for them to be charged with murder or manslaughter or reckless homicide were not met. You can't make it so just because you think it's just. And 7 attorneys, the Courier Journal did an article a few months back, 7 prominent attorneys, 3 of them black.
Aubrey Williams, Jan Waddell, another one. I've been in court against all of them. Very competent, powerful attorneys. Said you can't do it. You can't make that charge. The elements are not met. You can't make it so because you believe it's just or you wish it so. That's kind of where I have an issue. I get angry with that same sort of implication that Ms. Scott did about policemen in general. It seems like there are some violent protesters out there. Can we all agree on that? People that cause the problem, the small percentage that want to break out the windows and create damage and threaten people. But they were told that it's unfair to blanketly paint all the protesters that we've had out here in the streets for months with that same brush that we use to describe the violent ones. That's not fair. It's a few wrongdoers. Oh, but that doesn't apply to the police. So in the instances when there's actual wrongdoing on the part of police, now we're all bad, right? ACAB, all cops are illegitimate children, all cops are bad. So it's the same kind of conflation. It's not fair in either situation. They certainly don't seem to see that. They don't, do they? No. And I think one key thing that you said there was evidence. I just can't say something is so because I feel that it's so. I need some evidence here. And I think that one thing that's lacking is the evidence that policemen, not just in Louisville, Kentucky, but all throughout the United States of America, are targeting Black America. They're going after Black America.
LeBron James are literally hunting us down. Corbin is demonstrably false, proven to be false. There's a number of studies that show it's false. The one that comes to mind right off the top of my head is the one that a black Harvard economist, not white, a black Harvard economist did in, I think, 2016, Roland G. Fryer. He felt it had to be true, too. Whites are definitely shooting more black. The only reason could be racism. So he did a study. He found out the exact opposite. That actually white officers, there's no evidence of bias. In fact, white officers were less likely than black officers, minority in policing. They were less likely to shoot black suspects than whites. They're actually about 20% less likely to fire upon them. He called it, this is his quote, the most surprising result of my career. That's what he said. This is a guy whose goal was to prove racism existed, but being a man of integrity and in his work, that it wasn't true. I think it was 2014. A lady named Dr. Lois James. She wrote in the journal, put an article in the Journal of Experimental Criminology. They wanted to test racial and systemic bias in police shootings. So previous research, they'd said blacks were more likely to be perceived as having weapons, right? So that's why people were shooting. We thought they had a weapon. They did a study where they used laboratory simulations to flash images of people and objects. And the subjects were required to decide whether or not to shoot. So there's 800 scenarios, and out of those, nearly 600, 580 something required deadly force. And out of those situations, unarmed subjects were shot 47 times. These are people that perceived there was a weapon. How many of them were black? One.
Wow.
Unarmed white suspects were shot 46 times. The unarmed blacks were shot only once. And also the subjects that were the test subjects, they waited longer to shoot the black suspect. And so they found that the subconscious associations between the race and the threat that were exhibited by the participants were not linked to shooting behavior. And there's lots of studies out there like that. Washington Post has been keeping track of police shootings for 5+ years now. And there's roughly about 1,000 a year. And the vast majority are found to be justified out of the fact that people that were being shot were armed with deadly weapons in position to harm or kill the police officer. So out of that, maybe 50-ish that were questionable and so-called unarmed. But out of those unarmed, you've got, I think, 40, maybe 55 or so % of the subset were white. So you've got, like last year, I think there was 14 so-called unarmed blacks. And by I say so-called, some of these people that were unarmed, they were caught at the end of a long car chase and they had weapons available to them, say in a car, but when they got out there, they weren't able to access it. So technically at the time they were shot, they were unarmed. But there's that's 25 to 30% of the subset of that 50 were black. Well, there you go. There's your evidence, Corbin. 13 to 14% of the population is black. You're shooting nearly double that many of unarmed blacks. There's your racism. That's kind of specious in itself. You have to take the underlying evidence of criminality. And the sad fact is 53% or so of homicides are committed by that 13% of the population. 60% of other violent crimes or robberies, etc., are committed by that 13%. And we can break it down even further because the vast majority of those, unfortunately, are black males. So now we're talking, 6-7% of the population are responsible for over 50% of homicides and 60% of other violent crimes. Is this to say there's far fewer shootings than you would think there would be? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, there's evidence that black people just got a tendency towards criminality. Isn't that a terrible thing? I won't delve into this deeply, but to me, that tells me there's a problem with the society or socioeconomic status of those people. I can be more specific. There's a problem with the families. And the vast majority today of black children are born out of wedlock, like 75%. In 1960 or 65, whenever the Moynihan report came out, it was such a scandal because it was 22% out of wedlock birth rates. Dude, we'd love to go back to 22%. It's closer to 75% now. As President Obama himself said, not Doug Sweeney, when there is no father in the home, you are 5 times more likely to be poor or commit a crime. You're 9 times more likely to drop out of high school. You are 20 times more likely to end up in jail. That's President Obama. That's people born without a father. I think I mentioned before to you, Kwesi Mfume was asked in an interview with Larry Elder, given the presence of white supremacy, because that's the problem, right? Or the absence of fathers in the home, which is more detrimental to the black community. Without hesitating, he said the absence of black fathers. That's not anything we have to debate. There's far too many studies that show that. That's the real issue, and that's the thing we should be focusing on, not these specious arguments that there's a problem with racism in policing. By the way, Corbin, I'm not saying there are no racist cops. That would be foolish just to say there's no racist doctors, salesmen, teachers. I've got a plan to get rid of all racism. It's going to require the elimination of the human race. But once we do that, boy, we've whipped that racism bug. The question is the racist attitudes of some people preventing you from getting ahead? It was either Gallup or Pew did a study asking blacks if they felt where they were in life, socioeconomically, was a result of racism. 60% said no. Of those, when they entered really poor neighborhoods that were crime-riddled, they were not graduating from high school and they were getting arrested. The Pew study, I think, is the one that said 30%, only 30% of blacks interviewed in those situations said, yeah, it's due to racism. That's why I can't get ahead. These are the people themselves living in these dire situations. And only 30% of that subgroup said, yeah, it's racism. That means 70% that think, no, it's my own bad choices.
Right. And what you bring up is very important for Americans, particularly white Americans, to understand. What Doug has brought up has been really quietly discussed within the national black community for years and years and years. Haki Matabutu, Jawanza Kunjufu, many of these guys have brought this up about the breakdown of the black family, fatherlessness, and the kind of impact that's having on our young people. Star Parker, she heads Urban Cure. She's done extensive research in the whole situation of black urban centers, neighborhoods, and she's not saying it's systemic racism. She said, no, there are other factors here. And one of them is what Doug has just repeatedly brought up, the whole issue of breakdown in the family and fatherlessness. As a matter of fact, there's a great book out called Fatherless America, and people should pick that up. And there's also Larry Elder. You'd mentioned Larry Elder, Doug. I think it's in his book, Shut Down, where he devotes a whole chapter to basically what you just said, how the fatherlessness has had such a negative impact on the black community, far-reaching, powerfully negative impact on the black community. And really, the only thing Obama did, he just brought it up. It's not like this is something new. He's just talking about bringing up something that within the black community has been discussed for a long time, but somehow or another, when it comes to Democratic Party politics and battling against Republicans.
Corbin, it's about power. First off, you can't have power if you're not voted into office. So if you're going to get voted into office and you're a race merchant like an Al Sharpton or a Jesse Jackson or more local ones, it doesn't do you any good to be in a post-racial society. If you can convince everybody all of your woes are due to racism, due to the white man holding you down, or the white society, or the machine, right, the man. And if you convince them, you can keep them voting in large enough blocks, which I think the Democrats can generally count on about 90, close to 95% votes from blacks, regardless of whether they're being helped in any way. They ought to stop and say, I keep voting for this guy, but I'm still in the same situation I had before. What's happened with this, I take it back to the Great Society. What happened between 1965 and today that now we have such horrible crime and we have such high illegitimacy rates and out of wedlock births? Because, Corbin, the black family back in real systemic racism, institutionalized racism, right, of the 64 Civil Rights Act, people living in that period before, the black families were much more likely to be intact. Yeah. Even going back to the days of slavery, Corbin, the majority, according to census data, of black families were intact. Of course, there's the horrible situations where husbands and wives were sold out away from each other, the kids. But the fact is, the majority actually still live together. And black unemployment rate in the late 1900s, the 30s, and up to the 40s was actually very low. Right. They didn't start getting out of proportion until they started getting all the help from the government. Because when you take a program, and let's say it's a well-intentioned program. Young lady, if you have a child out of wedlock, if you have two, if you have three, we're going to take care of it. We're here to help you because poverty is a horrible issue. You can't get ahead if you're in poverty. And so we're going to give you money. Well, but there's a condition. If you have a father in the home or you get married, then the check goes away. You just encourage the women to marry the government. You disenfranchise the men. You give them very little incentive. And let's say you're a guy that would like to do the right thing, but heck, I can't, my skills are to such a point I can't provide for the kids I've had, so I'll let the government step in. KKK couldn't have come up with a better plan to destroy the black family. And they're willing participants. They line up for this. It's a shame. Here's what the Great Society have done. It has taken away agency from black Americans. They're trusting their fate and their outcome in life to the white, we'll say it's the white society. We're going to keep voting you in because you're going to keep taking care of us. Rather than saying, no, you got to get ahead. You look at some people like Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, who grew up in the projects or in deep poverty. Thomas Sowell grew up in Harlem. By the way, when he grew up in the 40s, 30s, 40s, they didn't lock their doors. They didn't hear gunshots at night. There was not the crazy kind of violence. That started or in the 60s and 70s. But these were people who had people in their lives that exacted results from them. They expected something of them. You didn't do your homework? You're not going outside. You sit down and you do your homework, and you're not going until it's done right. And you're not going to go visit with your friends. And if you come home with another C, you're going to be grounded. And the neighborhood Shelby Steele grew up was extremely poor. He wrote once that the guy in his neighborhood who was like the royalty was a Pullman car conductor on the trains. That guy had money, right? But out of his 2 doors down from him, Melvin Peoples, the famous movie maker, grew up. Around the block was a lady who became a famous professor, doctorate. In the same neighborhood, there was an FBI guy that became head of the Western, Division of the United States. These are people who grew up in extreme poverty, but had one thing in common. They had parents in the home, and they demanded that they have high expectations of themselves because the parents were going to have high expectations. And I think that's what's missing today is somebody holding you accountable. The agency for your success and getting yourself out of your situation is handed over to the government. And the Brookings Institute, which is a liberal institution, by the way, said there's 3 things you can do. 3 things you can do to almost guarantee you will not live in poverty. Finish school, get a full-time job, get married, and then have children, in that order. If you do that, the chances are 75 to 80% that you will not live in poverty. 3 simple things. And if I bring that up, I'm being racist and I don't understand and the situation,
Right. They'll say you're blaming the victim. What you just said is exactly what Urban Cure, Star Park and Urban Cure said. Finish school, get a job, keep a job, marry, then have children, which Urban Cure added to that, give back to the community, save and invest your money. We can do a whole show on this. We're going to need to wrap up. Doug, people have to know your background. You'd mentioned you're doing undercover work, and I know you wouldn't bring this up, so I'm going to bring it up. One time you were almost killed in the line of duty. I know that for a fact. You almost killed in the line of duty. So you're just not talking like you're some professor on the Ivy Hill or whatever. You were there.
Right. Corbin, I did narcotics. One thing you always said, if there's drugs, there's guns. If there's guns, there's probably drugs. And I can't tell you how many hundreds of people I encounter with weapons. But one example, because we're talking about the unarmed people that are being slaughtered by police. I had a situation, a fellow that was 15 years younger and 6 inches taller, about 110 to 120 pounds heavier, consented to a search because he said he didn't have any drugs. And I said, well, do you mind if I check? He said, yeah, you can check, Sweeney. So he said, let's step into the bathroom. He volunteered. Let me get some back to it. People tended to hide their drugs between their buttocks or under their scrotum. So he said, look, I'm going to pull down. You can see that I have nothing in here. Well, he pulled it down just a little bit because he kind of fronted in front of his friends saying, no, I don't care. And then he had to kind of fall through. Well, there was a big baggie sticking between his cheeks, and I knew what that meant. Well, he knew what it meant too. He began to fight. We're in a small bathroom, probably 5 by 5, 6 by 6 maybe, and the fight's on. I'm yelling for my partner, but I didn't know he had taken everybody outside. He's trying to get my gun. The only thing that saved me was I kind of able to extend my legs and kind of upright and then pull myself back down. And I hit his head into the sink and kind of knocked him senseless and was able to get him cuffed. That's one of those cases like, I'm about to die. There's no way I can overpower this guy. That was one situation. I chased a guy all through a project neighborhood from Michigan. And when I finally caught up, kept reaching into his pocket. I thought he was going to try to throw his dope out of his pocket, which is what's common. But instead, he finally produced a pistol and held it a foot away from my face. Just on the mere fact that he blinked, and I was able to grab the gun and take it away from him, get him on the ground, get him cuffed. When I picked the gun up, the hammer was back on it. I do believe God's with me in a lot of these situations, Corbin. There's many, many times I could have shot somebody justifiably, those two being examples. There's another one where the so-called unarmed subject, I and another extremely strong police officer couldn't contain, and he was trying to get our guns, and I was doing everything I could as far as use of force continuum, because I taught that for the police department, how to use defensive tactics legally and safely. My last tactic was hitting this subject in the scrotum with a flashlight. He was feeling nothing. Me and this guy, he benched 400 pounds. I was benching 350, could barely contain this guy. Finally, 3 other officers came and we were able to get him contained. But this guy's trying to get our gun. Right. Had he grabbed my partner's gun, I was going to shoot him, or mine. And if he grabbed mine, my partner would have shot him. This guy ended up being, it was either PCP or angel dust. I can't remember now. Felt zero pain, extraordinary strength. And these two strong guys, we would have both been justified to shoot this guy, take our hands. But what would happen if somebody came by today and filmed that and saw me hitting them like I was? 2 white cops brutalizing black subset. No context, no background. By the way, the reason we stopped the guy is because he had been threatening someone in Arcadia neighborhood with a handgun. That's why they told us he went down Arcade towards 7th Street. We were able to pull him over and get him stopped. There was a gun in the car. Fortunately, he didn't have it on him. Could have been a lot worse. But you see what I'm saying? That was an example of a guy that already threatened some people with a gun. He was extremely high on drugs. But for the grace of the God and some eventual help from 3 other officers, we did not have to take his life. And trust me, I've known racist cops, Corbin. I don't know that I've known anybody that would have risked their livelihoods, their freedom, the embarrassment to their family. I've been to jail, try to kill a black person just because they're racist. Maybe, I'm sure there's been examples where they've used too much force, fighting them and getting them handcuffed or giving them extra hits and punches when they shouldn't have. In fact, there were 3 examples of that back in 2000s, I believe. And all 3 officers that were involved in a situation where they tuned up, as you might call it, a guy that was mouthing off in the back of a car, were fired and convicted federally, I believe, civil rights violations. So the department doesn't like it. Good cops don't like bad cops. The department doesn't like bad cops. I've been through so much training to try to keep us within the law, give us understandings of different groups, whether it's LGBT or people with mental issues, medical issues. We're always going through training like that. Liability is a huge thing on the police department. They do everything they can to make sure they don't get bad officers, but sometimes you do. How come every time a black person is killed by a police officer, and let's say he's unarmed, why is it automatically because they're racist? George Floyd, as horrific as that was of the scene, why was it because Chauvin was a racist? He probably could have done that to a white guy, but it happens that the George Floyd was black. Why is the default assumption he shot a black person, he's a racist? How about maybe he overreacted? It was dark. He thought he saw a gun when he didn't. He was scared. Any number of choices other than the fact, though, he shot him. He's a racist. How about these names? Because you can say Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, George Floyd, any number. Who's Daniel Shaver, Corbin, or James Scott, Andrew Thomas, or Michael Parker, Lawrence Simpson, or James Boyd? Tell me when one of these names means something. Mary Hawk, Jonathan Ayers. Have I mentioned a name yet that you recognize?
No.
All of them are white people that were shot unjustly by police.
Wow.
And some of them in similar situations too. And I'm not just talking going back 20 years. This was just the last couple of years, last year or so. These are all people that probably were shot without justification. Was it because the white cop hated the white people? Or did they overreact? Did they overuse their authority? Did they? Any number of reasons, Corbin, besides them being racist. But you can't say any one of those names. By the way, since Breonna Taylor was killed, there have been 84, at least 84, there may be another, at least 84 black people, mainly males, killed by homicide in our city. I would like to know how many of those names people can name. I'm not sure they can. Yeah, in Louisville. Just Louisville. Not all year. I'm just talking since March 13th when Breonna. There have been in our city this year at least over 520 shootings, not where they didn't result in homicide. 424 of them are black. Wow. That's a tragedy. It's not cops doing it, Corbin.
No.
The vast majority of known suspects, of the ones they were sure of, are 62% black and 5% white. And again, there's some tragic stuff going on in our neighborhoods, and it's not white cop racism.
Right.
There's some other things we need to address and figure out what can we do to stop this. It's not the white racist cop.
We're going to conclude here with the remarks. I think, speaking to my listeners, I think what Doug has brought out is very, very important. Folks, where's your evidence? Where's your evidence? Are we asking the right questions? And apparently we're not asking the right question when we just jump to the conclusion, oh, there's a white cop involved, black person's been killed, it must be racism. And then we're ignoring the evidence, the overwhelming evidence that there's a high amount of violence within the black community, black folk killing black folk. And that's really something a lot of black folk have been quietly saying, but they've just been ignored as far as the mainstream media is concerned and to some degree academia. And I also wanted to have someone like Doug come on so that people can understand it is hell to be a police officer as far as I'm concerned. It is hell. You can't pay me enough money to do what those guys do. When they go into a situation, they don't know if they're going home that day. They don't know if they're going to get shot. They don't know. And then you have a situation where in self-defense or in defense of another officer, all of a sudden you got these people coming out in the street, disrespecting them, destroying property, and then you have public officials making statements like this about they're the Ku Klux Klan and this has been going. since 1863 and that kind of stuff. We have to be more outspoken about this. And we have to be doing more research, and we need to be more supportive of our police officers, not just in Louisville, Kentucky, but throughout the United States of America, because really, those guys serve and protect us in so many different ways. So many different ways. They get little to no appreciation or respect. Doug, I'm going to conclude with my own story.
Before you say that, say one thing, Dad.
Yes, please.
All those homicides, now there's like actually 140 some odd homicides, but all those black or white, who's solving those? It's the police officers. They're the ones who can say their names. They're the ones out there trying to find the killer. And since the vast majority are black subjects, why would police even get into homicide if they're racist? They're there to find justice. If you're a racist, you don't want to go into an area where every day you're going to be investigating black crime. You wouldn't care, right? The officers care. They don't get in there and get little sleep and constantly being called out and deal with this so they can solve crimes of black victims of whom they don't even know. Easier positions on the police department. These officers care, and their job is important, and they're going to be the ones that bring some sort of justice to these families.
This goes straight into what I was going to say real quick. And I was in my dingy little one-room apartment. My cat been getting pregnant every other day. I heard this banging on the door. I yell out, "Who is it?" And they said, "Police." And I said, "Oh my God." I was scared to death. And I opened the door and I said, "Officer, can I help you?" He said, "Sure, please, maybe you can." He showed me this photograph and he said, "Do you possibly know where this child lives? We're trying to find his parents." And I said, "What do you mean?" Wandering around with a blanket wrapped around him. Doug, he was no more than 4 or 5 years old, cute as a button. And the police officers are going door to door asking, "Do you see, possibly know who these parents are?" And I said, "Well, where's he at now?" He said, "He's in the car with my partner." He said, "We're just trying to find where he lives." You don't get those kind of stories on the front page of the Courier Journal or Leo.
No.
If it was me, my attitude would have been, "Man, I'm calling CPS. I ain't got time for this." But these guys going around door to door, showing the picture, trying to help. He was a baby. He's like 4 or 5 years old, just wandering the street in a blanket. That's the kind of stuff officers do on a regular, daily basis. And they don't get any type of recognition.
Well, they're not doing it for the paycheck because it's lousy right now. I worked with people with master's degrees and doctorates who could make far more money in private society and did make far more money, came into this business because they cared about people and they wanted to make a difference. And that's the vast majority of them, Corbin. But with the attitudes now towards police and the fact that they're trying to keep them from getting raises and bringing their pay up, there's too many competing agencies and too many competing jobs. You're going to get the police department you pay for, and you're going to get those officers that can't really get jobs elsewhere because it's too competitive. Where do they go? Well, the police department will hire them. Their standards are lower. They're not paying anything. Keep that in mind before you want to defund or keep the police from getting decent living wages. Right?
Doug, I appreciate your time, man. This is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host.